Galileo and the photodiode, in which is shown that the humble photodiode can tell light from dark as well as Galileo.
Do you see a way out of this dilemma? One that does not substitute an enigma for a mystery? Asked Alciuri, leading Galileo through a side door. Alciuri wanted him to perform a thought experiment. After all, Galileo was the champion of thought experiments. Was he not the first to make use of them in the service of the new science? Galileo remembered word by word how he had managed to establish the relativity of motion. Shut yourself up with some friend in the main cabin below decks on some large ship, and have with you there some flies, butterflies, and other small flying animals. Have a large bowl of water with some fish in it. Hang up a bottle that empties drop by drop into a wide vessel beneath it. With the ship standing still, observe carefully how the little animals fly with equal speed to all sides of the cabin. The fish swimming indifferently in all directions. The drops fall into the vessel beneath, and, in throwing something to your friend, you need throw no more strongly in one direction than another. The distance being equal, jumping with your feet together, you pass equal spaces in every direction. When you have observed all these things carefully, though there is no doubt that when the ship is standing still everything must happen this way, have the ship proceed with any speed you like, so long as the motion is uniform and not fluctuating this way and that, you will discover not the least change in all the effects named. Nor could you tell from any of them whether the ship was moving or standing still. Then he remembered how he had undermined the very foundations of Aristotle's physics, and formulated the first law of dynamics, the principle of inertia, relying not on conclusive experimental proofs, which would have been difficult to acquire, but simply on the power of his imagination. So he had imagined a perfectly spherical ball, moving on a perfectly smooth plane, never encountering even the slightest resistance. And by imagining this ideal situation, he had concluded that the ball could do nothing other than continue to move uniformly, requiring no further force to maintain its motion. So what was Alciuri thinking of? A thought experiment to reveal the essence of consciousness? The side room was exceedingly bright, unfurnished except for a comfortable chair in the middle. Alciuri invited Galileo to put himself at ease. Sitting on the chair, Galileo at first felt dizzy, as there was nothing upon which to focus his eyes. In front of him were no discernible walls. It was as if a boundless white screen encompassed his field of vision. The dizziness went away, and all that was left was the perception of pure light. Alciuri quickly explained the experiment. Galileo was simply to report whether there was just light as it was now, or whether everything plunged into complete darkness. Galileo need only say light or dark, depending on the circumstances. Nothing more was required. Alciuri urged him not to think, not to allow his mind to wander, and instead to concentrate on which response he should provide, light or dark, however simple the task might seem. And then Alciuri left. Indeed, soon thereafter everything became dark, but for an instant only. Then it turned light again, then dark, then light again. Galileo had to respond rapidly, as light and dark alternated as fast as he could speak, and report light or dark. Galileo was diligent, and announced each transition. After a few moments, Alciuri was back in the room, inquiring whether Galileo had seen both light and dark. The task was so simple-minded that it took no brains, thought Galileo. Did Alciuri mean to imply that Galileo was blind? Was Alciuri aware of his failing eyesight? Had Galileo signaled incorrectly a few times? Of course, he had seen light and dark, dark and light. What could have been easier? What was the significance of this experiment, if there was any? Alciuri said nothing, but pointed to a thin line of wire attached under the chair. The wire came from a small hole in the floor, and at its tip, facing toward the front of the room, it carried a little glass bulb. That was a photodiode, Alciuri said. One of the simplest machines one could possibly build. A supremely simple object. A photodiode is nothing more than a miniature electrical circuit containing a variable resistance, he said. What causes the resistance to vary is exposure to light, so that the flow of current increases when the light becomes more intense. And so he explained that, all along, while Galileo was shouting whether he saw light or dark, the photodiode too had been doing the same. Whenever the light had turned on, making the current rise inside its only circuit, the photodiode too had sent an on signal and an off signal whenever the light had turned off, making the current drop to zero. From outside the room, Alciuri had been recording both Galileo's responses and those of the photodiode. As far as he could tell, he said, the responses of the photodiode were every bit as accurate as those of Galileo. Indeed, the responses were indistinguishable. They had both passed the test. The purpose of this strange duel between the great Galileo and the mere photodiode was now dawning on one of the contenders. It seemed to Galileo that the question he must ponder was simple enough. Was the photodiode conscious of light and dark the way Galileo himself was? Did the photodiode have the privilege of subjectivity? Did it experience the qualities of light and dark? Galileo did not even stop to think. The answer must be no. "How can you be so sure?" interjected Alciuri at once, as if savouring an impending victory. The experiment proved that the photodiode did just as well as Galileo at distinguishing between light and dark, if not better. On what grounds, then, could Galileo conclude that the photodiode would not see the light and the dark just as well? Galileo knew that the photodiode was nothing more than an electrical circuit that could only change its state, on or off, according to the lightning. That could never be enough to engender a conscious experience of light and dark. Of this he was certain. But why not? What was the critical difference between the photodiode and himself, if there was one? After all, he had been reading eagerly every single book Frick had given him, and he had learned that the nerve cells in his own brain were not that different from photodiodes. He had read, for example, that photoreceptors in the retina behave just like sensitive photodiodes, though they are made of flesh rather than metal, and though the mechanisms by which they respond to light are different. True, these receptors were connected to other cells, and these in turn to other cells, until they reached the highest levels of the brain. But he remembered Frick telling him that cells higher up in the brain, no matter how high up, were still behaving very much like photodiodes. And indeed, our capacity to experience light and dark depended on those photodiode-like cells, and we would lose it if those cells were destroyed. Galileo now saw the thrust of Alciuri's argument. His own capacity to distinguish between light and dark was based on certain cells in a certain part of his brain. In principle, these cells were little more than photodiodes made of flesh. Given that a human being seems to have a conscious experience of light and dark, depending on the activity of photodiode-like cells somewhere in his brain, then why shouldn't the photodiode too have a conscious experience of light and dark? Galileo was confused, but something made him hold firmly on to his belief. A photodiode cannot be conscious of light and dark the way a human being is. He could not come up with a satisfactory explanation. Galileo knew that, but an explanation must exist. Of this he was quite sure. As he was sure of one of the foundations of his thinking, perhaps the most important one, the principle of sufficient reason. Nihil est sine ratione, cure potius sit quam non sit. There must be a reason why things are the way they are, and not another. This was a principle that Galileo had always tried to follow. There must be, thought Galileo, some necessary and sufficient conditions whereby the activity of certain cells located in the visual cortex is associated with a conscious experience of light and dark, whereas the activity of the photodiode is not. But which conditions? This, then, perhaps in its simplest form, was the first problem of consciousness. Notes. Turing, a pioneer in the debate on artificial intelligence, proposed the Turing test to find out whether a machine can think and perhaps be conscious. He suggested that an intelligent machine and a human be set up in one room and that they should engage in teletyped conversations with a human interlocutor in another room. If, after a given time, the human interlocutor could not tell which of the conversation partners was the machine and which was human, then the machine had passed the test and could be called intelligent. Here, Alciuri obviously meant to administer a Turing test to Galileo, albeit the simplest possible one. The quote is from the Dialogo sopra I due massimi sistemi del mondo tolemaico e copernicano, Florence, 1632. The Chinese man in the room with the file cabinets is Emperor Yongzheng, whose chest betrays Charles Babbage's analytical engine, one of the first mechanical computers. The philosopher John Searle laid out the Chinese room argument in Minds, Brains and Programs, Behavioral and Brain Science, 1980. There he argues that a machine following a set of instructions would not think or be conscious or enjoy meaning the way we do, even if it were able to answer all kinds of questions appropriately and thus pass the Turing test. He shows this by imagining that inside the machine there is actually John Searle, who carries out the instructions without understanding a word of Chinese. You're locked in a room with a bunch of Chinese symbols on cards, and you have a program which tells you how to give them back through a slot in the wall in response to other cards coming in. And all the same, you don't understand Chinese. The argument is used by Searle to make the point that one cannot get meaning, semantics, out of mechanism, syntax, but it can also be used to claim that one cannot get consciousness out of computation. Indeed, Galileo will come to the conclusion that there is no meaning without consciousness, and that, in a fundamental sense, consciousness and meaning are one and the same thing.